Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story nestled deep in the folds of time, a tale of peasant weddings in the medieval world, where sacred vows were exchanged beside livestock, where flowers mingled with manure, and where love, such as it was, bloomed through sweat, survival, and shared stew. Before we settle into this journey through rough-soled shoes and rustic rituals, take a moment to support the channel if you find yourself drawn to this kind of content. And as always, drop a note in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from and whether the sun's rising or setting on your side of the world. Dim the lights, let the whir of the fan fade into background comfort, and allow yourself to step out of your century and into theirs. Imagine a world where wedding invitations were neither embossed nor sealed with wax. There were no couriers galloping through muddy roads bearing news, and no fluttering parchments tucked beneath doors. In a village hemmed by wheat fields and forest edges, news of a wedding traveled on the wind, carried on the lips of neighbors like a wandering song. It might have started as a murmur beside the well. "Did you hear? Thomas is marrying Beatrix." And from there, the words would catch like dry kindling. By dusk, even the chickens would be clucking about the upcoming union. There was no such thing as an exclusive guest list. Attendance wasn't a privilege, it was a proximity-based inevitability. If your feet could carry you to the edge of the celebration, you went. The notion of an RSVP would have baffled them. There were no plans for who would sit where, no carefully tallied numbers. One wedding might be modest, attended by a dozen cousins and half a dozen neighbors. Another might draw bodies from neighboring hamlets, all elbowing for stew and ale, whether they knew the couple or not. With more guests came more offerings, gifts measured not in gold or goods of display, but in whatever sustenance someone could spare. A basket of eggs, a hen wrapped in a woven sack, or, if fortune smiled, a wedge of cheese tough enough to withstand a journey by foot. These weren't tokens of affection, they were investments in the new household's survival. But just as many showed up uninvited, others were absent without notice. A man might forget entirely, absorbed in harvesting his field. Others might be drunk or dead or misled by the shifting sense of time that governed village life. Noon was a concept more than a fact, and the sky was their only clock. Shadows stretched and shrank, and somewhere between feeding the animals and churning the butter, the day moved forward, unmeasured, unhurried. The wedding wasn't about pomp. The couple had no expectations beyond managing not to lose a shoe or trip into a ditch during the vows. Seating, such as it existed, was found rather than assigned. A log or rock would suffice. A haystack was prime real estate. If you got there late and a pig had claimed your spot, well, that was that. The pig stayed. No arguments. Clothing was pragmatic. Fashion, if you could call it that, was about covering skin and avoiding the worst of the day's dirt. The bride might have a dress slightly less faded than usual, perhaps one spared from this year's onion harvest. It was rarely white. White was the domain of nobility and folly, easily sullied and impossible to clean. More likely it was brown or a worn gray, patched in places, possibly fraying at the hem. If it still held its shape and had a belt to cinch it, it was good enough. A garland of flowers might adorn her head if the season allowed. If not, a ribbon salvaged from an old curtain might suffice. The aim wasn't to dazzle, it was to not appear freshly dug from the fields. As for the groom, his efforts were minimal but sincere. He might splash water on his face and scrape the dirt from under his nails. If he owned shoes, he wore them. If not, his bare feet were expected and accepted. The idea of refinement was less about polish and more about the effort to appear marginally less like a farmhand. Everyone smelled faintly of livestock. No one minded. They were used to it. Soap existed, but it stung the eyes and stripped the skin, made in small batches from fat and ash, and rarely wasted on a day where you'd likely end up just as filthy as before. Bathing was sporadic, tied to seasons or rainstorms rather than routine. Most guests arrived neither perfumed nor pristine, but recognizably human. That was enough. A well-worn cloak was elegance, a clean tunic was sophistication, a full set of teeth. Prestige. Children arrived streaked in mud and giggling with anticipation. They carried sticks, beetles, or bruises with the pride of young warriors. Old women wrapped in layers squinted critically at everyone, whispering comparisons to their own long-past weddings. But no one expected glamour. This was a reprieve, a rare break from days governed by toil. Here, even patchwork garb could feel regal if it came with music and meat. The wedding location, like everything else, was dictated by practicality. A clearing near the churchyard was common, though not within the church itself, reserved as it was for nobility and saints. Peasants gathered wherever there was enough space and not too many animals. Sometimes the vows took place beneath a tree, beside a pig pen, or near the graves of ancestors who, one might hope, approved. If it had rained, which it often had, the ground was soft and full of hidden puddles. Guests tried not to lose their footing or fall into the churned-up mess where chickens wandered and cows occasionally bellowed in protest. Benches were rare and claimed swiftly by the oldest and most insistent. The rest leaned against fences or crouched in the muck, their patience as worn as their boots. Decorations were largely incidental. A ribbon here, a flower there, perhaps a bit of cloth tied to a stick. The scenery consisted of weeds, livestock, and the hopeful flutter of fabric in the breeze. But even this rawness held beauty, because amidst the mud and mayhem was something deeply communal, a shared exhale from the demands of survival. People came together not because they were summoned, but because they could. Because in a world that rarely offered celebration, this was joy, muddy, mismatched, loud, and real. As the guests gathered and murmurs quieted into a kind of rustic anticipation, the bride and groom stood before the priest. Not beneath a canopy or within a hall of stone, but wherever the ground was dry enough to hold their feet. It might have been under a crooked tree or beside a chicken coop half obscured by vines. The animals didn't care for ceremony, neither did the villagers. There were no sweeping violins or choirs cloaked in velvet. The only music was the shuffle of boots, the distant bleating of sheep, and perhaps the occasional whistle of wind threading through hay bales. This wasn't a wedding arranged for spectacle. It was, at its core, a declaration. Two people, mud-streaked, calloused, and probably a little nervous, stood in front of their kin and said, "I am yours, and you are mine." That was the heart of it. The priest's presence, though increasingly mandated by the church as the Middle Ages wore on, was often more symbolic than essential. In earlier days, villagers could simply declare their intent in front of witnesses, and the union would be considered valid in the eyes of both community and heaven. The ritual had little to do with poetry and much to do with agreement. The vows themselves were spare, often awkward. "I take thee" was about the extent of the romantic language, and if the priest had other duties that day, perhaps a funeral or yelling at a stubborn goat, the whole affair might be over in the span of a few coughs. There were no long speeches, no rings gleaming under candlelight. Jewelry was scarce, reserved for the noble and the very lucky. If a token was exchanged at all, it was something small and useful. A knife, a strip of woven cloth, maybe a copper coin bent slightly from use. The kiss, if it happened, was quick and practical. After all, 6 days without a proper bath made the idea of locking lips less charming and more hazardous. More often, the couple clasped hands or simply nodded with solemnity. That was enough. In their world, words were sacred, not because of the parchment they were written on, but because of who heard them. If witnesses stood by and the couple spoke aloud, the commitment held weight, and once those words were said, the expectations began. A shared life, shared labor, shared burden. If the bride hesitated, eyes darting toward the forest as if gauging the distance needed to run, the priest was technically obligated to pause the ceremony. But delays were rare. A sharp glance from a mother or a reminder that the dowry had already changed hands was usually enough to keep things moving. Consent was essential in theory, but reality was often more complex. Still, in many cases, the couple truly chose each other, at least as much as life and station allowed. Love, when it existed, was more of a quiet resilience than a courtly passion. And then, just like that, it was done. No fanfare, no fluttering petals or soaring hymns. The couple stood not beneath gilded arches, but beneath a sky that might promise rain. Around them, neighbors shifted their weight, children fidgeted, and someone's dog began licking a discarded bowl. The sacred was stitched into the ordinary, the divine was mingled with dung, but despite the roughness, the weight of the moment was undeniable. These two peasants, clothed in patched linen and hope, had committed themselves to a life of cooperation, of hardship, of shared mornings and long winters. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was survival, with tenderness layered between chores and childbirth. And after the words were spoken and the witnesses satisfied, the feast began. Or, rather, the feast uncoiled like a tired but enthusiastic serpent. Slowly, imperfectly, but with intent. There was no banquet table set with silver and crystal. There were no serving staff in crisp uniforms. There was instead a pot, a single massive cauldron suspended above a fire, filled to the brim with whatever could be spared. Barley, cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips, bubbling together in a brew that smelled of warmth and effort. If a chicken had met its end that morning, its bones and meat added depth to the stew. If not, the broth relied on herbs, salt, and hope. Bread, if present, was hard-edged and heavy, capable of bruising a knee if dropped. Cheese was a miracle. Fruit, rare, precious, might arrive dried and skeptical of its own edibility. Bowls were shared. Hands were used. Fingers were licked. Spoons, if they existed, were wooden, often communal, and occasionally chewed by the family dog. But it was food. Real, hearty food. And that meant fullness, something that didn't happen every day. Children ran in circles, crusts in their fists and mud on their knees. Elders chewed slowly, eyes half closed with the comfort of stew that didn't need to be rationed. Dogs snuck between legs, hopeful and only mildly scolded. The scent of boiled cabbage mixed with ale and sweat, a perfume that marked the occasion as something special. Ale flowed freely, home-brewed and potent, it burned the throat and loosened tongues. Mugs were passed, and if you had your own, you kept it close. If not, you borrowed or drank from your cupped hands. Water was present, but eyed with suspicion. Everyone knew it was safer to drink the ale, despite the headache it might promise later. As the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched like lazy cats across the grass, the meal became less about food and more about fellowship. Second helpings were offered, thirds were eyed with envy. Laughter rose, sputtering at first, then full and unself-conscious, and somewhere in the mix of root vegetables and spilled ale, a community reminded itself why it endured. Not just for the harvest or the hearth, but for moments like this, when life was hard, but joy, however brief, was shared. The idea of gifts at a medieval peasant wedding didn't revolve around sentiment or luxury. There were no monogrammed towels or handwritten cards, no delicate boxes tied with ribbon. There was only one guiding principle. Bring something useful, something that could be eaten, worn, planted, or, if circumstances were desperate, bartered for something else. A gift was not so much a celebration as a contribution to the ongoing struggle that was married life. Guests arrived with their offerings slung over shoulders, tucked under arms, or carried in calloused hands. A pair of eggs wrapped in straw, a small sack of barley, a half-wilted cabbage. If someone had recently butchered a pig, a chunk of salted meat might make an appearance, and the bride would be congratulated with solemn nods that meant, "This is a good start." A neighbor might hand over a wooden spoon that had clearly survived a few generations. Another might bring a dented jug of ale or a handful of shriveled apples that still held the memory of sweetness. There were stories, whispered over bread and broth, of one gift, a clay jug with a chipped lip, that had made the rounds of half a dozen weddings, never used, never claimed, always passed on like a sacred relic. The generosity behind these gifts wasn't theatrical. No one expected applause, but the act of giving was a public gesture of goodwill, a silent agreement that said, "We see you, we support this union, and we hope you'll remember us when it's our turn." The economy of peasant life was one of reciprocity. Give today, receive tomorrow, or next year, or when the blight takes the potatoes and your family is suddenly counting every crust. Even the poorest tried to arrive with something. Showing up empty-handed was noticed. People whispered, people remembered. And then there were the oddities, the gifts that walked the line between generosity and comedy. A goat with a limp, a hoe with no handle, a spoon that had clearly been gnawed on by something with small, sharp teeth. Yet even these were accepted with the kind of practiced gratitude that peasants had mastered, because at the end of the day, something was better than nothing, even if that something honked, smelled, or collapsed upon inspection. These exchanges weren't simply about survival. They were about visibility. When a villager gave something of value, even a modest value, it marked them as engaged, invested, loyal to the fabric of the village. And that mattered. It wasn't just a marriage being recognized. It was a household being established, and every egg or belt or half-drunk bottle of ale was a thread woven into the social web of the community. Naturally, a cast of characters emerged at every wedding. Familiar, flawed, and undeniably alive. There was always the one who talked too loudly, the one who remembered every scandal from the past decade and was only too happy to share it. Usually an older woman with a sharp tongue and a sharper memory. She began her blessings with warmth and ended them with jabs sharp enough to make the groom sweat. "Bless this couple," she'd say, though we all remember how he flirted with Marjorie behind the bakehouse last harvest. Close behind came the village-wise woman, wrapped in shawls, eyes gleaming with the knowledge of herbs, gossip, and curses. She might mutter a blessing involving a root no one could identify, or tuck a sprig of something pungent into the bride's bodice for fertility. People smiled and nodded, though no one dared make eye contact for too long. Her words were strange, but her presence was strangely necessary, like a gust of wind that blew the veil just so. There was the retired soldier, still wearing the dented helm from a skirmish that probably never happened, telling the same war story for the 30th time. He'd roar his congratulations and promptly trip over a log, to the delight of the children. And then, of course, the drunk uncle, red-faced, affectionate, and clumsily poetic. He'd try to dance with a goat, give the couple a gift wrapped in cabbage leaves, and declare that love was a battlefield. Everyone ignored him until he started singing, and beneath it all pulsed the steady hum of gossip. It was the unofficial language of weddings, buzzing through the crowd like bees over honey. Who had shown up late, who had brought a gift that looked suspiciously recycled, who was seen talking too closely with someone else's sweetheart. If the bride's dress had a mysterious stain, there were theories. If the groom looked pale, someone swore he'd been cursed. The chatter began during the ceremony and continued for weeks, woven into stories told by the fire, passed between market stalls, embroidered into village memory. Children, meanwhile, roamed like miniature barbarians. There were no babysitters, no attempt at control. They darted between legs, shouted at animals, and threw clods of dirt at each other with gleeful abandon. If one tumbled into the stew pot, or close enough to raise gasps, it was considered a near miss worth telling stories about for years. Toddlers were dropped into the dirt like satchels. Older kids organized themselves into packs, declaring ownership over hay piles or the best places to sneak sips of ale. There was always one child who took it upon themselves to become the wedding sheriff, enforcing pretend rules with all the tyranny of a tiny landlord. At some point, a toddler would waddle directly into the ceremony. The bride, without breaking eye contact, would hoist the child up by the collar and pass them off to the nearest responsible adult, or at least someone pretending to be. No one was surprised. No one scolded. The chaos was part of the choreography. Weddings, after all, were among the few times children were allowed to be completely wild, to shout, to tumble, to steal scraps of bread from benches and vanish into the hedgerows. And if they returned, sticky, bruised, and missing a shoe, that meant it had been a good celebration. The music, when it began, was not orchestrated. No ensemble, no choir, no delicate harp playing in the background. It came from whoever was brave enough or drunk enough to claim they could play. And in every village, there was at least one such soul. He'd arrive clutching an instrument of questionable origin, a fiddle with a cracked neck, a flute that wheezed more than it sang, or a lute that had long since given up trying to stay in tune. No matter. Sound was what mattered. Rhythm was optional. Sometimes, instruments were entirely improvised. A pot and a stick. A bucket flipped upside down and tapped with bare hands. Two jugs struck together in a clumsy beat. In the absence of anything functional, someone might simply whistle through the gaps in their teeth, and that, too, was music. If all else failed, the choir of uncles took over, voicing the one wedding song they all vaguely remembered. Usually out of key and out of order, until their voices cracked or their legs gave out. Drums were replaced by stomping feet, clapping hands, or the occasional sack of flour being slapped in time. Even the animals joined in, a rooster crowing at the wrong moment, a dog barking along with the chorus, a goat, confused but committed, bleating as if to add a harmony. And still, no one winced. It was music, loud, chaotic, possibly enchanted, but music nonetheless. Dancing followed as naturally as clouds follow the sun. But this was not courtly dancing. There were no practiced steps, no lessons in etiquette. There was only instinct and ale. People flung their arms around each other, stomped in unison, lost shoes, and found rhythm in the slap of bare feet against wet grass. If someone knew a fancy step from a story or a distant cousin's tale, they might attempt it, only to fall mid-leap and laugh their way back to standing. Children spun themselves into dizziness, crashing into hay bales and older relatives. The elderly watched from their seated positions or leaned fences and clapped along, cheering anyone who managed to stay upright through more than 2 songs. The bride and groom were, inevitably, pushed into the center. A chorus would rise, calling their names, hooting encouragements, some sarcastic, some sincere, and the newlyweds would do their part. A shuffle, a turn, an awkward wave. Laughter filled the air. For a moment, no one remembered the toil of planting, the ache of old injuries, or the cold that would come with next week's rain. The dancing grew wilder as the night wore on. Boots were kicked aside, shirts unbuttoned. Breath steamed in the chill air. Someone started a conga line without knowing what a conga line was, simply pulled by the rhythm and the impulse to move. The line twisted around the bonfire, past the stew pot, through the mud, until it collapsed in a heap of limbs and giggles. And that was the point. It wasn't grace that was celebrated. It was life. The sheer pleasure of movement, of freedom, of shared joy in a world that so rarely allowed it. And through it all flowed ale, thick, homemade, and suspiciously strong. It was the lifeblood of the party, sloshing from jugs, poured into wooden mugs, and sometimes sipped straight from ladles meant for soup. No one questioned its strength, though many would regret it later. Some ales were mild, fit for the elderly and children. Others were so potent they could knock the sense from a grown man in 2 swallows. Guests drank anyway, because water, when it was available, was far more dangerous. It carried filth, disease, and invisible threats. Ale had been boiled. Ale was safer. Ale was sacred. Mugs passed from hand to hand. If you had your own, you were lucky. If not, you shared without hesitation. Germs, as a concept, had not yet been invented, or at least not acknowledged. Ale brought looseness to limbs and boldness to speech. Compliments flowed freely, even if they were bizarre. "You have the knees of a king," one guest might slur to the groom. "Your teeth are very symmetrical," another would offer to the bride. No one was offended. The ale excused all. Someone would inevitably drink too much. There was always one. He would begin by singing, progress to shouting, and conclude by vomiting behind the pigsty or falling asleep beneath a cart. No one scolded. It was tradition, and tradition was sacred. In truth, ale did more than fuel the celebration. It dissolved boundaries. It made enemies laugh together. It turned gossip into song and shyness into courage. In a life filled with labor and uncertainty, ale gave people permission to let go, to dance badly, to sing loudly, to flirt without shame. It transformed a practical contract of marriage into something joyous, something memorable, something worth remembering, even if no one quite remembered it clearly the next morning. Morning after a medieval peasant wedding was not the sunrise-tinted piece of fairy tales. There were no birds chirping in harmony, no dew-kissed fields greeting a new chapter of life. Instead, there was the aching groan of bodies unaccustomed to dancing, the stale scent of ale still hanging in the air, and the unmistakable sense that someone had definitely slept in the pig enclosure. Guests began to emerge from wherever they had collapsed the night before, curled into haystacks, slumped under carts, draped across fence rails like forgotten laundry. Some were missing shoes. Others were wearing someone else's cloak. One man wandered out of a chicken coop, blinking like he'd forgotten the concept of morning. Another discovered, to his dismay, that he'd been cuddling a cabbage. The feast site was a battlefield. Stew pots overturned, half-eaten loaves scattered like casualties. A single boot dangled from a tree branch inexplicably. The fire had burned down to cold ash, and dogs prowled the remains, licking bowls and stealing scraps. A chicken roosted comfortably on a bench, claiming it as its own. No one tried to remove it. Children, of course, were already up, awake far too early, still sticky from last night's jam or turnips or something unidentifiable. They sang bits of the wedding song with new lyrics of their own invention, chasing each other with twigs and yelling about who got to be the bride in their reenactment of yesterday's chaos. One small boy proudly carried a goose egg the size of his head. No one knew where he got it, or whether the goose was okay. The bride and groom were nowhere to be found. Rumors passed through the crowd like smoke. They were still asleep. They had eloped. They had built a house overnight and were already raising sheep. Most likely, they were hiding from the noise, tangled in hay and sweat and the first breath of their new life. When they did finally reappear, hair tousled, faces flushed, eyes heavy with exhaustion, they were greeted with approving nods, smirks, and more unsolicited advice than any human could ever need. The older women were especially generous with their commentary. "That boy'll need a strong back if she's anything like her mother," one would mutter. "Hope they didn't use the red blanket," another would add with mysterious authority. Despite the mess, no one complained. This, too, was part of the ritual, the aftermath, the unwinding. Stronger stomachs began cleaning, bread crusts were collected, mugs were stacked. Someone rolled the barrels back into storage, though one was suspiciously light. Others sat quietly on logs or stones, heads in hands, nursing their hangovers with grunts and whispered prayers. Not spiritual ones, just desperate pleas for silence. The priest wandered through, fresh-faced and irritatingly alert, hands folded behind his back. He had not overindulged. He remembered everything, and worse, he was ready to talk about it. People avoided his gaze. But under the grime and the groans was a quiet satisfaction. The wedding had happened. The couple was married. The village had gathered and celebrated, with all the joy, nonsense, and minor injuries that implied. It had been messy. It had been loud. It had been real. And it had given everyone for just a little while something bigger than their toil and their worry. A reason to dance, a reason to laugh, a reminder that even mud-caked boots and mismatched tunics could make for a moment worth holding on to. When outsiders imagined medieval weddings, they often pictured something grand. Floral garlands, white gowns, solemn songs echoing through stone halls. But that was a world away. The peasant wedding in all its muddy, musical, cabbage-scented glory was something else entirely. It wasn't elegance. It wasn't spectacle. It was a pause, a celebration, a shared breath in a life that rarely offered such luxuries. There were no bards to immortalize it, no painters to preserve it in oils. But the memory lived on, told and retold beside fires, whispered over fences, woven into the rhythm of village life. It lingered in the way an old couple smiled at each other as they passed the same stew pot months later. In the echo of a song hummed under breath while mending boots, in the stories of turnips and goats and ale-induced confessions passed from one generation to the next. The peasant wedding belonged to the people, and for all its clumsiness and chaos, it mattered. Because it was theirs. Every peasant wedding, without fail, contained a small kernel of chaos. Not the planned kind, not fireworks or surprises, not something sweet or sentimental. This chaos was organic. It simmered beneath the laughter and drink, waiting patiently for a goat to escape its tether, or someone to say the wrong thing to the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. It often began with flirtation. Weddings were, after all, one of the rare occasions where villagers could see each other dressed up, relatively speaking, cleaned if not fully clean, and with ale-softened eyes. Most days you saw your neighbors bent over fields, faces sunburned, brows furrowed, teeth gritted against the wind. But at a wedding there was dancing, drink, a flash of ribbon in someone's hair. The mud didn't disappear, but it didn't seem to matter as much. It was, by every measure, prime matchmaking territory. Glances lingered longer, smiles were offered and accepted. A flower might be awkwardly tucked behind an ear. Someone might try a verse of poetry, stolen from a wandering minstrel or half-remembered from a story. "Thy smile is bright, like goat milk in May," one young man muttered, earning both a laugh and a pat on the back for effort. But not all flirtations landed softly. Some landed like a stone in a stew pot. Someone would dance too close to someone else's intended. Someone would spill ale on someone's only good tunic. Someone, inevitably, would make an unfortunate comment about someone else's sister. Voices rose. Chests puffed. And before anyone could intervene, a fight would begin, not with swords or violence worthy of ballads, but with shoving, shouting, and rolling around in the mud like particularly determined sheepdogs. These weren't deadly duels. No one wanted blood, just the satisfaction of knocking someone over and feeling for a brief moment triumphant. Within minutes, sometimes seconds, it would be over. The combatants would sit up, blinking, mud-covered and suddenly less angry. Someone would offer a mug. They'd drink, shake hands, and slur apologies. No one held grudges for long. The village was too small and everyone had to see each other at the next funeral. Then there were the accidents. Weddings were full of moving parts, people, animals, food, fire, drink, and any combination of these created risk. Children fell into barrels. Dogs ran off with entire loaves of bread. A goat once dragged a bride 10 feet across a muddy field, her veil tangled in its horns. She emerged with grass stains and a wild look in her eye. The goat was later honored with the first bowl of stew. At another wedding, someone sat on a beehive. They didn't notice at first. Then they did, loudly. The guests learned 2 things that day: never place a bench near buzzing, and old Magda could still run faster than anyone expected. The laughter that followed lasted longer than the sting. None of these mishaps was seen as disasters. They were stories, instant folklore. They were told and retold, embroidered with new details, until no one quite remembered what actually happened. And that, in many ways, was the point. The chaos made the wedding real. It made it alive. Eventually, sometime after the 3rd round of stew and the 5th round of ale, someone would look around and ask the question, "Where'd the bride and groom go?" And just like that, the mood would shift. A knowing murmur would ripple through the crowd. Eyebrows would rise, shoulders nudged. The older women would purse their lips and mutter, well, they didn't waste time. Because everyone knew. They had disappeared to consummate the marriage, not just for love or desire, but for legality. In medieval Christian Europe, a marriage wasn't fully recognized until it was sealed physically. Some communities once sent witnesses to ensure the act occurred, a mix of tradition, control, and deep-rooted awkwardness. But by later centuries, the more sensible villages had abandoned that custom. Privacy was respected, at least to the degree that privacy existed. The couple would sneak off to a barn, a back room, or wherever a blanket and a little quiet could be found. There were no locks. Curtains were rare. If you were lucky, someone had cleared a patch of hay and muttered a prayer. It wasn't romantic in the poetic sense. It was practical, intimate, real. And while they were gone, the party carried on. No one paused the dancing. The music didn't stop. If anything, the absence of the couple gave everyone else more to speculate about. Bets were made. Jokes were told. "He's already asleep," someone said, laughing. "She's running the farm already," said another. When the couple returned, faces flushed, hair tousled, clothing rumpled, the village received them with a mixture of teasing and celebration. The groom was clapped on the back. The bride was offered bites of fruit and advice she never asked for. Some couples didn't return at all until the next morning, preferring to hide away and let the party dwindle without them. No one judged. After months or even years of courtship, they had earned their privacy. There were no honeymoons, no grand adventures to far-off cities. Just that brief stolen hour, the only escape they might ever have from neighbors, chores, and commentary. And when they came back, if they came back, it was to resume life not as individuals, but as a unit, a pair, joined not just by vows or ceremony, but by action. And the wedding rolled on. By the time most guests began to sway from fatigue rather than music, the wedding had already taken on a kind of mythic quality. Not because it was grand, but because it felt, if only for a day, like something outside the usual cycle of toil. Yet the line between celebration and collapse was always thin. That final stretch of the night, when candles burned low and the ale began to run dry, was when the strange magic of the medieval peasant wedding truly took over. As the hours dragged into that twilight realm between night and dawn, people loosened even further. Manners, already threadbare, fell away entirely. The storytelling turned bawdier. The singing grew less melodic and more desperate. Some guests began reciting riddles they half remembered from old travelers. Others declared their intentions to compose poems, only to forget halfway through and switch to insults delivered with great affection. Somewhere in the corner, the same couple that had been arguing over a goat 2 years ago was now dancing together in blissful oblivion. A man claimed he saw the Virgin Mary in the stew pot's reflection. No one contradicted him. A dog was found wearing someone's hat and refused to give it back. One toddler declared herself the queen of weddings and attempted to knight a chicken. It pecked her. She cried, then laughed, then promptly fell asleep on top of the same chicken. This was not chaos in the destructive sense. It was catharsis. All year long, peasants toiled under skies that offered too much rain or not enough. They lived with the knowledge that a single bad harvest could ruin them, that plague might return, that nobles might ride through and demand tithes, that God might test them again. But tonight, in the glow of fire and laughter, none of that mattered. They were together, they were fed, they were warm, they were, briefly, safe. The bride and groom, now fully married by word and deed, were no longer just villagers. They were the axis around which the celebration turned. They had entered a different kind of adulthood, not the quiet slog of daily survival, but the honored weight of partnership. They were no longer just Beatrix and Thomas. They were a household, a future. When they laughed together or held hands beneath the table, others took note, not because it was rare, but because it was sacred. Eventually, the wedding began to thin. Not end. These events rarely had clean conclusions, but dissolved slowly, like fog in the morning. One by one, guests slipped away. Some vanished into the shadows, arm in arm. Others simply curled up where they sat, wrapped in cloaks or cloaked in snores. The music slowed to the occasional hum. The fire burned low. The final mug of ale was passed around like a relic. At last, what remained was a silence filled with echoes. The kind of silence that lingers when joy has filled every corner of a space and then gently drained away. Not emptiness, memory. And so the peasant wedding ended, not with fireworks, not with applause, but with quiet breathing, the crunch of straw underfoot, and the knowledge that something good had happened. Something unruly, imperfect, loud, muddy, joyful, and true. Dawn didn't ask for permission. It simply arrived, slow and gray and indifferent to the hangovers it illuminated. The village, so recently alive with voices and footsteps and dancing, had gone quiet. Smoke curled from the dying embers of the fire. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Late, confused, perhaps offended by the debris littering its usual path. Guests began to stir, blinking against the light, nursing sore limbs and tender skulls. They emerged from every imaginable resting place. Under carts, inside barns, halfway inside their neighbor's cloak. One man was discovered curled up with a half-eaten loaf of bread like it was a child. Another woman, still wearing one boot and holding a wooden spoon, swore she hadn't sat down once. No one believed her. The feast site resembled the aftermath of a small, oddly festive battle. Scraps of food lay scattered across overturned benches. Mugs lay abandoned like fallen soldiers. A particularly fat chicken strutted through the remains with a sense of purpose, as though inspecting the carnage. Someone found a lone shoe in a tree and no one could explain how it had gotten there. Children, as always, were the first to reclaim the morning. Unbothered by fatigue, they raced about, singing songs that bore little resemblance to anything sung the night before. One girl had a piece of ribbon tied around her head and declared herself queen of all the weddings. Another was dragging a stick and solemnly announcing each puddle she jumped over as a sacred marriage hole. The imagination of a child did not pause for recovery. Among them wandered toddlers with sticky faces and mysterious stains. One passed proudly clutching a goose egg, eyes wide as though he had discovered a treasure. No one asked where he got it. No one wanted to know. The bride and groom remained absent, still hidden in some hayloft or behind the barn, recovering in private. They had, after all, earned this brief escape. Soon they would return to the rhythm of village life, tending animals, hauling water, dealing with neighbors who had all, very publicly, watched them stumble into matrimony. But not yet, for now They were legends, symbols, half dream, half memory. Cleaning began in fits and starts. Those with energy salvaged what they could, gathering crusts to feed pigs, stacking bowls, dragging the leftover barrel dregs to someone's cellar. Others simply sat on logs or stones, heads in hands, making vague gestures toward effort and muttering about next time and never again. The priest walked by, upright, clear-eyed, far too cheerful. He remembered everything and had a suspicious look that suggested he'd already drafted his next sermon based on the previous night's behaviors. No one wanted to be the first to speak of it, yet no one needed to. What had happened was now part of the village's story. A tale to be told during long winters and dull harvest days. A story with shifting details, where the bride would grow more beautiful with each telling, and the stew less watery, and the goat more heroic or more tragic, depending on who told it. There was no written record, no parchment or seal to immortalize the union, but it didn't matter. The memory lived in the sore legs of the dancers, in the bruises from playful shoves, in the crumbs stuck to tunics and the warmth that still clung to the air. For peasants, memory wasn't written. It was worn, passed hand to hand, breathed into stories, echoed in laughter. By midday, the village began to return to itself. Tools were retrieved, animals fed, fires rekindled for bread baking and broth making. Life resumed, but it wasn't quite the same. Not yet. For just a little longer, the spell of the wedding held. The air felt lighter, the chores felt easier, and every time someone passed the couple's hut, they smiled, quietly, knowingly. Because joy, even small and muddy and tangled in straw, left its mark. It's easy, centuries later, to imagine a medieval wedding as a moment plucked from legend, tapestries woven with perfect brides, noble grooms, flowered meadows, and delicate vows whispered in candlelight. But for peasants, that vision lived a world away. Their weddings were not designed for beauty or history. They were not events carved into stained glass or etched into illuminated manuscripts. They were lived, in full color, in full mess. And what they lacked in refinement, they made up for in something far more important: presence. These weddings weren't about elegance. They weren't curated performances meant to impress distant relatives or noble patrons. There was no seating plan, no music selection, no careful list of allergies. There were no professional bakers or embroidered banners or carefully worded speeches. There was only what the people could carry, what they could cook, and who they could become for one night in the brief glow of celebration. The real value of a peasant wedding wasn't in the dress or the stew. It was in the act of gathering. Life in the medieval village was hard, brutal at times, relentless in its demands. Hunger lingered like a shadow. Illness arrived without warning. Taxes pressed from above, and weather struck from all directions. Time was measured in harvests and funerals. In such a world, joy became a rare commodity, a risk, even a rebellion. But weddings gave permission to pause. For one day, the tools were set aside, the fields left unplowed, the firewood gathering postponed. Even if only briefly, people could put down their burdens and pick up a mug, a song, a partner's hand. They could eat until they were full, laugh until their sides ached, dance until they couldn't stand, all of it wrapped around the simple act of saying yes. Yes to a life together, yes to another season, yes to something like hope. It wasn't about beauty, yet there was beauty, in the way the bride brushed straw from her skirt with nervous fingers, in the way the groom looked up, surprised that so many had come, in the flicker of firelight on old faces, the sudden song of children spinning barefoot in mud, in the elderly couple at the edge of the crowd, watching quietly, remembering their own vows spoken years ago under a different sky. There was beauty in the chaos, in the stew that burned at the bottom, in the ribbon that wouldn't stay tied, in the ale that spilled, The goat that escaped, the child who cried and then forgot why. And most of all, in the shared understanding that this was life, not a pause from it, but part of it. Because even when the dancing shoes were just the same muddy boots used to till the earth, even when the veil was a borrowed rag tied in good faith, even when the music was a warble of whistles and the feast a bowl of root vegetables barely held together by broth, it was still a celebration. It was still sacred. The wedding didn't need a cathedral. It had the open sky. It didn't need an altar of marble. It had the worn hands of two people clasped together, ready to face what came next. And surrounding them, a circle of others who knew what that meant, who knew that marriage wasn't about lace or jewels. It was about endurance, about warmth in the cold, about knowing someone would share the weight of the bucket, the cradle, the bad seasons, and the long walk home. That was the legacy of a peasant wedding. Not glamour, but grit, not spectacle, but story. Not something preserved in glass, but something carried in memory. In the hum of a harvest song, in the quiet strength of two hands in the dark, in the way one generation whispered to the next, "This is what we did. This is how we began." The legacy of the medieval peasant wedding doesn't exist in books or official records. No heralds announced it, no scribes wrote it down. What remains is memory, not personal, but communal. A residue passed through generations not by parchment, but by storytelling. Around hearths, in fields, beside rivers, these stories were spoken, reshaped, exaggerated, softened. They lived because people needed them to. Because when so little could be held on to, memory became its own form of permanence. And the stories weren't always flattering. In fact, they often leaned toward the ridiculous. The drunken stumble, the child who mistook the stew pot for a hiding place, the uncle who lost his trousers mid-dance and never noticed. These moments endured, not despite their silliness, but because of it. They were funny, they were human. They made people laugh in a world that offered few excuses to do so. The beauty of these weddings was not in how they defied hardship, but in how they embraced it. They weren't moments lifted out of the world. They were planted firmly within it, thick with mud, sweat, smoke, and joy. Everything real, nothing wasted. Even the mess served a purpose. And though the bride and groom stood at the center, they weren't alone. The community made the wedding. The laughter, the food, the music, the teasing, all of it was shared. The couple wasn't just making vows to each other. They were entering a pact with the people who would raise their children when illness struck, who would lend them tools when theirs broke, who would mourn them when they were gone. That's what made these weddings powerful. Not the ritual, not the blessing, not even the feast, but the gathering, the collective pause to say, "We're here. You're one of us. We won't let you face this alone." Years later, that memory might rise again in quiet moments. While stirring the same stew pot used that day, while watching children tumble through the same fields where dancing once left footprints in the mud, while walking past a tree that once held the only piece of ribbon in the village, flapping like a banner of resistance and joy. The world these people lived in was unpredictable, sometimes cruel, but for one day they created something else. A pocket of time where there was enough food, enough warmth, enough laughter. And for peasants, that was a kind of miracle. No stained glass ever captured it. No tapestry ever honored it. But it lived on, echoing in every moment when hardship paused and hearts opened. That was the wedding. That was the story. That was the legacy. Before the first jug was lifted or the first cup filled, there were rules, strict, ritualized, and older than the guests who obeyed them. Because what followed the peasant wedding in our tale was something very different. A change of place, a shift in time, no longer a muddy yard in a forgotten village, but now a quiet, candlelit room in ancient Greece. Here, the air smelled not of stew and hay, but of burning incense, wine-soaked wood and perfume. Here, leisure was sacred. The Greeks called it schola, a word that would one day give birth to our modern idea of school, but which for them meant something rarer and more profound. Time set aside not for labor, but for thought, for pleasure, for reflection. The symposium was the vessel of that time. To the uninitiated, it might seem like just a drinking party, a room full of men lounging on couches, laughing and toasting and debating the gods. But it was much more. The symposium was a ceremony. It was politics hidden beneath poetry, philosophy wrapped in flirtation. It was a stage where masculinity, intellect, and social standing were all tested in equal measure, and often, all at once. The evening didn't begin with wine. That would be uncivilized. It began with a meal, the dénon. This was eaten reclining, not because it was luxurious, but because the Greeks believed posture shaped thought. Upright was for soldiers, reclined was for thinkers. The meal was substantial but secondary. Meats, breads, fruits, perhaps fish, depending on the host's wealth. But it was only the prelude. Once the food was cleared and the floor swept clean, the real event began. Wine was brought forward, not to be drunk in raw form, but mixed carefully with water in a vessel called the crater. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric, something Scythians did, something un-Greek. The mixing ratio was dictated by the evening's leader, the symposiarch. He decided how drunk everyone would become. Weak wine meant an evening of poetry and gentle riddles. Strong wine meant a descent into chaos, sometimes divine, sometimes disastrous. Before the first sip, libations were poured to Dionysus, god of wine and madness. A quiet invocation, a reminder that this wasn't just a party. It was a dance between discipline and desire. Wine was the instrument, not the purpose. And so the symposium unfurled. Slowly, like smoke from an oil lamp. Songs were sung. Some hired musicians played lyres and flutes, others recited from Homer. There were riddles passed from couch to couch, stories half-remembered from the Trojan War, and compliments offered to beautiful youths who reclined in practiced grace beside older patrons. These boys, often the sons of aristocrats, were not just ornaments. They were students in the truest sense, learning how to speak, how to resist, how to charm, and how to endure charm with dignity. Theirs was a performance as careful and complicated as any war dance. The conversations drifted from lust to politics to the nature of justice itself. And all of it was soaked in wine. Not drowned, soaked. There was an art to maintaining one's mind while surrendering the body. The perfect guest could quote Plato and flirt at the same time. He could lose a debate but win admiration by how cleverly he lost. This was the true measure of manhood. Not violence, but control. The room was arranged in a circle, intentionally. There was no head of the table, no throne. Everyone could see everyone else. Every word spoken was witnessed, every glance returned. This was a social crucible. It forged friendships, it forged legends, and sometimes it forged enemies. The air in the andron, the men's chamber designed solely for the symposium, was thick with heat and meaning. This wasn't the heat of fire, but of presence, of bodies reclining close, of wine-warming blood, of perfume mingling with sweat and anticipation. Every detail in the room had purpose. Oil lamps flickered against painted walls, revealing scenes of satyrs and gods, of lovers in pursuit, of Dionysus raising his cup to mortals, caught in ecstatic revelry. These weren't decorations. They were reminders. Here, in this sacred space, play was not the opposite of intellect. It was its companion. At the center of the room, the crater sat like an altar. All things flowed from it. Conversations, confessions, poetry, seduction. and it was to this vessel that the symposiarch returned, cup after cup, to pour and distribute. The wine moved clockwise, always. Each round was more than a drink, it was a ritual. With it came a toast, a joke, a challenge. To drink was to participate. To abstain, unless you were elderly or ill, was to risk invisibility. The guests didn't just drink. They watched, they listened, they performed. A symposium was not a place to fade into the background. Every man present was expected to offer something, a clever line, a well-placed compliment, a reference to myth, or a sharp observation on love or honor. But underneath the laughter, the riddles, and the warmth of wine was a current of tension, erotic, intellectual, political. Much of it centered around the tradition of paiderastia, the idealized relationship between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger male beloved, the Eromenos. This bond, mythologized and moralized, was at once mentorship and desire, restraint and longing. The older man was expected to pursue with wit and patience, to guide without coercion. The youth, in turn, was to resist just enough, to accept praise but not surrender too quickly. It was a delicate game, not of deception, but of ritualized performance. To give in too easily was to be considered base. To resist too long, cold. The ideal lay somewhere in between, mutual admiration, mutual elevation, mutual testing of mind and spirit. These boys were not passive. They were sharp-eyed, well-trained, and aware of their value. They were expected to absorb not just attention, but ideas. Their beauty was only one part of their role. Their presence was meant to inspire philosophy, to provoke thought. In their company, men were reminded of the fleeting nature of youth, of the urgency of wisdom, of the strange marriage between desire and death. And always the heterae moved among them. These high-class courtesans were unlike any women most Greeks would encounter. Trained in poetry, music, conversation, and seduction, they were permitted where other women were not. They could own property, they could argue, tease, and even humiliate. They disrupted the all-male energy of the symposium, not by softening it, but by sharpening it. A well-timed remark from a hetaira could unmake a man more swiftly than spilled wine. The night stretched, ideas sparked, wine loosened tongues, and the distance between joke and truth narrowed. Arguments grew passionate. Not all of them were about love or beauty. Some were about the polis, about power, about who deserved to rule and why. Many of the political movements that would shape Athens in the classical era began here, on couches stained with spilled wine, between men who alternated between laughter and fury. But even in these arguments, there was performance. A guest might quote Euripides to explain his view on justice, then pivot into an anecdote about a drunken goat. Wit was prized. Slowness condemned. The man who could be serious and ridiculous in the same breath. He was admired. He became the soul of the evening. And when the music began again, whether from a flute girl or the slap of palms on clay, the night returned to its rhythm. Guests leaned in close. A joke became a whisper, a look held too long. Desire rose like steam from the crater, mixing with incense and sweat and thought. Because that was the essence of the symposium. It wasn't just about drinking or speaking or seducing. It was about layering those things until no one could tell where one ended and another began.